Hey guys, it's Melanie and welcome back to my channel. Thanks for stopping by. Today we are doing video 4. We're on the 4th video of my quilting series. We are going to be talking about free motion quilting your quilt today. Okay, so we have chosen our fabric and cut it. We have pieced it together in video 2. We have basted the quilt together in video 3. Now we're going to be quilting all of the layers together with free motion quilting. I'm going to show you all the steps, so don't freak out. I know it's kind of a big endeavor, but I'm going to show you all the steps to make it easy. And then the next video we'll be binding it and we'll be finishing it off. And a thank you to my sponsors who have helped make this series possible. Aurifil Thread, which is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be using Aurifil Thread to quilt the layers together, and I've got a great giveaway. I will give you more details at the end of the video, and it's going to be taking place on my Facebook page, so you can check that out. Also Clover, which has great high quality notions. The Wonder Clips are amazing. I love them. And my Quilt Box, which is a monthly, or you can pick some other options, a subscription service where they send you in the mail a box of great stuff. I have really loved the last 2 boxes that I've received from them. They have really great notions and fabric and tons of great stuff, so you can check them out too. If you use the code Melanie, you get 10% off of your first box. Okay, so similar to my last couple of videos, I'm going to start out by talking you through a lot of the details of quilting your quilts. We're going to talk about a lot of the different settings, what needle to use, what kind of thread, how you pick your design, all of that stuff up front, and then I will be showing you how I quilted the quilt in the video. If you want to see below in the description box, I will have the time code broken down so that you can skip ahead if you're watching this for the second time, so that you can skip ahead to the portions that you want to rewatch. Okay, so the first thing that I always think about when I am getting ready to free motion my quilt is, what design do I want to use? I think that is one of the hardest hurdles to kind of like get past. You have your quilt basted, it's ready to go, but you kind of have to decide on the design. Now, there's a couple of different things that you can go ahead and do. The first thing is stitch in the ditch. That's a very common way of quilting your quilt, especially for beginners, and it's basically following the lines of the quilt. So stitch in the ditch means when you have pressed your seams to the one side, the other side of the seam doesn't have that bulk of fabric underneath it, and you stitch right close along that seam, but on the ditch side of your seam. So that's a good way to get started. You can use a walking foot. It's really simple, but it does a great job, and so that's a good way to start. You can also use a walking foot and do straight line quilting. If you are nervous about the free motion aspect, this is a good option as well. You could do wavy lines with your walking foot. You can do straight lines. You can follow the lines of your pattern of your quilt. You can echo designs from your quilt. So there's a lot of options within that as well. Now you can also, of course, free motion your quilt. There's a ton of different designs. I actually made this little quilt here where I did a bunch of different designs. I'm going to show you in the video some different options. There's some flowers, some swirls, loop-de-loops, some back and forth motions, things like that. I also want to let you know I do have 2 other free motion quilting videos. So I have one whole video on swirls, doing swirls, and then another basics free motion quilting video. But if you want a free motion quilt swirls, I will have that video linked below because I'm not going to cover that in this video today. So my goal with this video is to show you lots of different options, because you don't have to quilt your quilt like I do. I'm going to show you how I did mine, but you don't have to pick that design. You can pick a lot of other different designs, and so I'll give you some resources for that. Angela Walters is one of my favorite quilters. She has a book. I'll insert some footage from the book. I have the iPad version. Great book on free motion quilting. I highly recommend it if this is something that you want to learn more about. Her designs show you exactly how to create the design and where to go next, which is the biggest part of quilting, is knowing where you're going and then where you need to go in order to create a smooth stitch. So you can check out her books. Also, I have created a Pinterest board under my Pinterest. I'll have that linked below. I've created a Pinterest board with a lot of different resources and different ideas, tips, tricks, and kind of, it's a good place to go for just like a wide variety of what the internet has to offer in terms of lots more ideas, design ideas, and things like that. Okay, so now let's talk about the types of thread that you could use to quilt your quilt. I like to use 100% cotton high quality thread. That is what I personally prefer in my quilt. I like Aurifil. I've used Aurifil to quilt probably most of my quilts, and so that's what I'll be using today. But there are also some other great options. So part of it is doing a little bit of experimenting, seeing what works well with your machine, what kind of result do you like, because each thread will create a slightly different look and a slightly different result on your quilt. Superior Threads has some good options. Angela Walters, like I mentioned, she likes to use So Fine, which is actually polyester thread, I think. And so really there's a lot of different options. Just make sure it's high quality, something that is going to withstand the free motion quilting and withstand the washing. So you could start with Aurifil, because you can use that thread for a lot of other different sewing projects down the road. And then as you get better, as you experiment some more, you can branch out and try some new things too. Okay, so needle size. The needle size is dependent a lot on the thread that you choose. Generally for machine quilting, you want to use a 90/14. 14 I think is the American number and 90 is the European number, but all of the packages will say 90/14 on them. That's the needle size I tend to use. If your thread is shredding or you're having tension issues, you can try going up to the next size. 80/12 is also a good number to try, but I've used 90/14 and that's always given me a good result, so that's what I would recommend. The other thing about needles is put a fresh one in your machine before you start quilting. I can't tell you how many times people have asked me tension issues, problems with their threads snapping, breaking, needles breaking, all this stuff. Change your needle, okay? Because so much of the time that's the problem. So put a fresh needle before you start quilting your quilt. Now the other thing that you need if you are going to free motion quilt your quilt is a free motion foot, or a darning foot is often called. Sometimes machines come with these, but if you're going to free motion, you got to have this foot. I'm going to go over the machine settings that I use on my machine in just a minute, but you will need to have that foot if you want a free motion quilt. When I first started free motion quilting on my Viking, before I got the Juki, I bought my free motion foot for like $11 or $12 on eBay. So just make sure that it fits within the model number of your sewing machine, but you can get them pretty inexpensively. The other good tool to have is gloves. These are called Machingers. The tips of them have these little grippies on here so that you can easily move the quilt around. Also, you could use gardening gloves. So if you have a clean pair of gardening gloves around, or you happen to be at the hardware store, you could pick up a pair of those with the little, rubber nubbies on them, and that will help you as well. I didn't use gloves for a long time because I don't really like having gloves on my hands. I like to be able to feel what I'm doing, but these seriously made such a huge difference when I started free motion quilting and kind of got a little bit more serious about getting better at it, and these really made a big difference. I still don't really love wearing the gloves, but they help so much that, what are you gonna do? The other thing to keep in mind is if you're going to be free motion quilting at night or in a basement or something like that, you want to have really good lighting because you want to be able to see what you're doing. A lot of times the sewing machine light that comes with the sewing machine is not enough. So you want to have some good overhead light. There's OT lights that you can move around and make sure that you can do that. Crafty Gemini actually has an LED strip that she's put like inside her throat space on her sewing machine, so I thought that was a really great idea and another way to get some good lighting. Okay, so we've gone over a bunch of that. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the design again. I want to backtrack a little bit because I feel like this is the trickiest part. You're not sure what to do. I stare at my quilt for a few days before I'm like, how am I gonna quilt this thing? So sometimes there's a little bit of thought that has to go into it, and at the end of the day, it's going to be beautiful no matter what you do to it. So I think when you're first getting started, don't let that part stress you out. You can easily do an all-over pattern, a meandering or a loop-to-loop pattern all over your whole quilt. When you're just getting started, that is perfectly acceptable. It's going to be beautiful when it gets washed and all of the fabric kind of gets all crinkly and soft, then it's going to be great. So don't stress out too much about it, but here's a couple of tricks. When I'm trying out a new design, I actually like to draw it out on paper. I know that's going to be hard to see. I have some close-ups. I draw it out on paper because you kind of get a sense of when you're doing your design where you need to go next in your design, and that's one of the biggest things about free motion quilting is that you need to know where you're going to be going. So I'll show you my designs. You see me kind of working on them, but that is a great way to practice, maybe just test some things out and give you a little bit of practice before you actually go to your sewing machine. Also, you need to create a little sample quilt. So like this one that I made, this is a scrap piece of gray, and I picked the gray so that you could see the purple thread on here when I do the demonstration. This is a scrap piece of wall, which is the exact same backing that I'm using. So that way I can determine whether my tension is good, if I have any other adjustments that I need to make before I start working on the quilt. And then you can also test out your designs, get some practice runs before you get going on the real deal. Also, if you haven't cleaned your machine recently, you want to do that. And now let's talk about the machine settings. On a sewing machine, you want to be able to drop your feed dogs down. So those are the little grippy metal feet that help run your thread along. You want to be able to drop those down. Some quilters say that it's not essential, so if your machine does not do that, you can still try it out on a practice quilt and see how it does for you. You also want to put your stitch length down to 0. It should be at about a 2.5 from piecing, so you want to put that down to 0. I'll show you some footage right now of me working on this. Okay, I'm going to show you how to bring the needle down into your fabric and bring your bobbin thread onto the top of your quilt with this sample, because once we are using the other quilt, it will be really hard to see. So you want to put your needle down, pull it back up, and then when you pull on this top thread, it will pull up the bobbin thread. So pull that out. Now once you start quilting, you can go back and forth in the same area for a few times to make sure everything is secure. Now I'm going to demonstrate the loop-de-loop quilting. That's one of my favorite ways to quilt. Try and keep your stitches as even as possible, not too large, so that they're securing your quilt together, and be wary that your hands are what is moving the quilt around. So get a good feel for that and make sure your stitches are even. Now my tension was off slightly. Make sure that you check that, and I made a small tension adjustment. Make small adjustments at first. I usually lower my tension to start with and see how that goes. Now double check it to make sure the tension looks good after your adjustment. Once you've got that done, your tension looks good, your design has been decided, you are ready to go, you've got your gloves and everything ready. You want to set up 4 to 6, depending on how dense your quilting is going to be, 4 to 6 bobbins that you wind up and get ready before you get going, because there's nothing more annoying than being in a groove and then you run out of your bobbin, which is annoying enough in and of itself. But then if you have to rewind a new bobbin, it kind of like breaks your groove a little bit. So I like to have a nice little stack of bobbins that I can just grab when I run out, and then I can continue going. Okay, so let's pretend that this is your entire quilt. And what you want to do when you are beginning to quilt it is break it up into quarters so that you just work on a quarter of the quilt at one time. That way you're not too overwhelmed, and also that way you can fit everything in your machine. My machine has a large throat space here, but many machines are a lot smaller. My Viking that I free motion quilted on for a really long time had a much smaller throat space. If you break it into quarters, you can maneuver the quilt a lot easier. So I would go like this. I would start in the middle, work my way around the outside edge, back up this way, and then travel over here. Work toward the middle, going back out, working toward the middle, going back out, and so on. So that is the way that I would organize it and break up the quilting on your quilt. Okay, so a few things before we get started. I'm sitting here with my quilt. One thing you want to make sure is to keep as much of your quilt as possible up on the table, so it's not dragging and you're not forcing your quilt to stay up on the table. It will really strain your shoulders over time. If you need to, You can set up right here along this side of your sewing table an ironing board or a spare chair to keep any extra quilt up on top of that. The other thing is have a dish nearby where you can put your pins as you take them out of your quilt. Okay, so let's quilt this thing. Okay, I will get different camera angles as we go along so that there will be plenty of shots for you to see what I'm doing. I've completed these 2 triangle portions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to lift my needle up, lift my presser foot up, and I'm going to travel without cutting my thread. So we're going to travel up to this guy. I am working in my solid triangles first before I continue with an all-over quilting pattern for the rest of the quilt. Then I'm going to put my presser foot down, put my needle down. I'm going to stitch a few stitches in the same spot to secure it. And then now I'll be ready to quilt this triangle. Now this is really only applicable if you're doing something like this. If you're going to be doing an all-over quilting pattern for your entire quilt, then you won't need to really worry about this. Before I get started, I take my pins out of the area I will be quilting. Now we are ready to quilt this triangle. If things are moving around and you need to make adjustments, just stop where you are. If you have a needle down position on your machine, put your needle down. Make any little adjustments and then continue. Now when you get to the end, backstitch a few times to secure your threads. And then you can cut your threads. So before I get started again, I want to make sure my bobbin thread is up a little bit more. It's gone in there. Your needle down and pull your bobbin thread out a little bit more, because then when you need to pull your bobbin thread up onto the top of your quilt, that way you have a longer tail to work with. Now here I am working on my all-over pattern. I'm doing this loopy stitch. I'm going to be fitting in 2 loops in each patchwork square. So you can see how I'm going. Everything is real time, so it's exactly how quickly I am doing it in real life. There's going to be 2 loops in each patchwork square. As you can see, that just helps me to know where I need to go, how large they should be. So now that I'm at the edge of the quilt, I'm going to travel down and then I'll go back the other direction. You want to avoid cutting your threads and restarting as much as possible. This makes it much more efficient and faster. Now when you have this much quilt under the machine, make sure there's nothing bunching underneath your needle. Okay to start and stop and readjust as many times as you need. Now this portion I did speed up. Everything else has been real time so far, but I did speed this up, and I basically just did this for my entire rest of the quilt. I will show you the finished results here in a minute, but just have fun with it, listen to a podcast, and relax and just have fun quilting your quilt. This can be a little tough on your shoulders, so if you need to, make sure you take lots of breaks. And I hope you are inspired to quilt your quilt in a really fun and a way that challenges you and pushes you to try something new. Have fun, you guys. Troubleshooting tips if things aren't looking very good as you stitch along. The first thing is make sure you have a fresh needle. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but really it's a very important step. So change your needle. The other thing is maybe change your bobbin. There was one time, I'll tell you, there was this, I was free motion quilting and it turned out my bobbin was defective. And it was making my bobbin thread do all kinds of crazy things. And it turned out to be a defective bobbin because I switched out my bobbin and then it worked fine. So that's maybe one thing to check out, especially if you have the plastic bobbins. I have the metal ones now. I've never had a problem with those, but the plastic ones, you never know. Also play with the tension on your sewing machine. So make small adjustments. I find a lot of times with free motion quilting, I drop down my tension a little bit. On your practice fabric, make small adjustments each time with your tension, going down a little bit and see how it's doing. So if you've done all of those things and the underside, your bobbin thread underneath the quilt is not looking good still, maybe try a different thread. It's possible that your machine doesn't like the thread that you've chosen. But do all of these things one at a time and then try it again on your practice piece. Because if you do them all at one time and then it starts working, you don't know which exact part it was having trouble on your machine then for the next time. So it seems like a little bit of an investment up front, but once you get to know your machine and how your machine likes to work with the free motion quilting, it'll be a lot easier for you to do it again the next time. Alright guys, I hope you feel more confident in your free motion quilting. I hope this gave you a ton of ideas, tips, tricks, ways to improve your free motion quilting. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment below. Also, for the Aurifil Thread giveaway, I'm going to be doing that over on my Facebook page, so you can see that linked below. I'm going to be giving away 2 sets of thread that I'm using for this quilt. So there's 6 spools of thread in each of the sets. So I'm going to be giving away 2 full sets. International entries will be fine for that. I don't mind doing that. Don't forget to check out my other sponsors, Clover and my Quilt Box. Thank you for making this series possible. If you are enjoying this video, please share it with your friends. We have binding next week, and then this quilting series will be done. You will have this series of probably over an hour's worth of content for you to keep coming back to every time you want to make a quilt. So I hope it's been valuable for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share, and I appreciate you. Thank you so much. I will see you in video 5. Bye. Okay, and a thank you to my sponsors.